Hi, and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford from Son of a Stitch, and if you subscribe to the channel, you probably saw my video recently where I went over some of the lexicon of cross-stitching, some of the specialized language and jargon that we use within the cross-stitching community, dare I say the cross-stitching subculture. One of the terms I introduced is frogging. That's what we call it when we make a mistake and we have to remove a few stitches from a project. Occasionally, this occurrence is personified as a villainous frog. So this week, I'm going to teach you some of my best tips for dealing with it when you get an unwanted visit at your house from the dreaded frog. Here at Caterpillar Cross Stitch, we are all about cross stitch, and we upload helpful and, we hope, entertaining videos every single week all about it. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next knowledge drop. And if you enjoyed this video in particular, give it a like and leave me a comment down below. Likewise, if you have a question that you'd like me to address on the channel, leave that in the comments as well, and who knows, maybe I'll make it the topic of a future video. Before I get too much further, I want to make sure to remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch VIP Stitch Club. When you join, you get 10% off your first order. You get a digital ebook with 8 free cross-stitch patterns in it, and you get a download of our top 10 stitching tips. So make sure you hit that link down there in the description so that you can get all of those great perks. Now, if you've been stitching for more than an hour, you've probably been there. You're stitching away, you've got your light just right, you've got your favorite show on the TV or your favorite audiobook or podcast in your ears, and you're churning out the stitches. And then you double check your pattern against your project and you realize all of those stitches were supposed to be 2 stitches to the right or 2 stitches higher. And now you have to figure out how to deal with this mistake that you've just made. I'm going to go over some of the best ways that I've found for taking care of things like that. And the first one is for the best case scenario. You haven't gotten very far, it's just a few stitches back and you don't have a huge mistake to correct. For this, I use a technique that I refer to as unstitching. It's basically just going back how you've come. But there are a couple of things that you need to pay attention to when doing that, so let me show you. Now, unstitching is pretty much just what it sounds like. We're just going to use the same needle that we've been stitching with to just undo the stitches that we did. Now, it's helpful if you remember the order that you did them. This is the last stitch that I did right here, so I'm just going to come right back up where I originally went down. And that last half stitch I did will come undone. Now, while doing this, I always use my other hand, so it's really helpful to have 2 hands for this. Use my other hand to pull the thread so that it opens up the hole a little bit so that I can see to get my needle down in through there. If the thread is partially blocking the hole, you might accidentally pierce it while pushing the needle back down through, and that's going to result in a really bad snag and fraying on your floss, so you don't want to do that. So use your extra hand to pull that floss to clear the hole. Now these ones I stitched English style, so they're a little bit easier. I don't have to figure out which is which. But I do the same thing on the bottom. I pull the floss so that it clears the hole a little bit. And now that stitch is undone. So I can keep going like that. And if I can't quite tell where I need to go, if I pull on the floss just a little bit, you can see that the last stitch that I did will wiggle just a bit. So that'll tell me where to go in order to undo the stitch. I guessed the wrong side there though. And especially when coming up through an area where there are other stitches, it's especially important to pull on that end to clear the hole so that you don't pierce through one of those threads, or you're just going to wind up with snags and this isn't going to work. So you can work your way back, but obviously this isn't super fast or efficient, so you don't really want to do it if you have to go back more than just a handful of stitches. Now, if you didn't catch the mistake quite so quickly, but you're still working on the same stitching thread, you just need to go back a little bit farther. You use a technique that I refer to as pulling stitches. Now, I'm pretty sure that this technique is the reason we call this frogging. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So since we have to undo more stitches, it's not going to be quite as practical to just undo some stitches. So what we do here is we actually unthread our needle or use a spare needle and stick it under the tips of those stitches and pull them out. This has a pretty distinctive sound. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now sometimes that sound can sound a bit like the croaking of a frog, which is part of why I think the term frogging has caught on so popularly. Now, while doing this, I have lost a needle because it's a lot harder to hold on to. You're holding it at a different angle, and occasionally the thread just breaks loose and the needle goes flying. So I have seen some people use a device called a frogger, which is pretty much just a blunt tip needle with a bead or something glued to the end of it, or something threaded through the eye, so that if you drop it, it's easier to find and won't get lost in the cushions. Now, if your mistake is a bit worse than that, for instance, you've already finished off the thread that you were working on, and you're on to another entirely separate section of the pattern before you realize your mistake, you're going to need to cut some threads and undo some things. And there are a few ways to do that. So let me show you some different techniques here. Now, my first resort in a scenario like this is really just to use my handy dandy embroidery scissors, which I always have on hand when I'm stitching anyway. So I can just slip the tip of my scissors underneath one of the stitches. And once I've snipped one, I can then use that same pulling method that I talked about to undo those stitches. And as I'm undoing a large area, eventually as this tail gets longer and longer, especially since it's been so kinked from stitching, it'll tend to start snagging and tangling. So we'll just pull it until that starts to be a problem, and then I'll trim it again. So that's a good fast way to undo the stitching in a large area. But if you're doing an even larger area, even more stitches, then that's where a seam ripper can come in really handy. I've seen a number of different kinds of seam rippers, and I recommend using one with a more narrow guide point here, and that doesn't have any sharp edges until you get all the way up into the crotch, for lack of a better word. And so what you want to do is just slip the tip of that under there, and then that'll cut the stitch when it gets up to the blade part in the crotch there. Now you're going to be really tempted if you're undoing a lot of stitches to just kind of get the tip there and kind of slide it along the surface of the fabric, cutting all the stitches as you go, like you would do if you were undoing some stitches while sewing. But there's a high probability of that tip getting down into one of the holes of your cross-stitch fabric and cutting your fabric. I see it all the time. So be very, very careful if you are using a seam ripper. Only cut a couple of stitches at a time. Then once you've cut them and you've got nice little pieces, you can just pull those out with a pair of tweezers and clear the area. Sometimes you realize you've made a mistake in the middle of a project. All the stitches around it are right, but you've accidentally filled in an area that you should have left open, or you've shifted a particular component in space, but the other stitches around it are correct. So you don't want to undo all of those stitches to get to it. Let me show you what I do in this case. So what you want to do in this scenario is selectively remove some of the stitches, but you're going to need to secure those threads afterwards. So this is where one of the tricks that I showed you in my floss chicken video is going to come in really handy. So what we're going to do is we're just going to cut one thread. Then we're going to use a blunt needle to undo a few stitches. Now we're going to have to undo stitches going in both directions because we're going to have two thread ends that we've just created that we're going to need to bury. And once we've undone just a couple of stitches, they'll be a little bit frayed, but we'll have a couple of just basically like half-inch lengths of floss here. Quite curly, a little bit hard to manage. So I'm going to use the trick that I used in Floss Chicken to bring those tails down to the bottom. So I've threaded a short loop. I've threaded both ends of a short piece of floss through my needle. And I will just use that loop to pull this floss down through. Do the same thing with this tail. So let's turn this over now. My hoop was in the way, so I had to flip it over. But I'm just gonna, since I've got the tails that I pulled down through here on the back now, I'm just gonna run my needle under some stitches with that same loop of floss that I used before. And then I'm gonna pull those tails inside that loop. Again, this is just like what we did in the Floss Chicken episode. It's very similar to the way you finish off a sheep shank knot. And then I'm just going to pull those tails under those stitches. If you're really paranoid, you can do that again, going back the other direction, but not under the exact same stitches. Make it a little bit more secure, but honestly, I've never really had a problem with this. And then I trim that. And now I've corrected that mistake with a minimum of unstitching, and I just have to repair those handful of stitches that I undid. This can be really, really useful if, for instance, you were supposed to leave a blank spot in the middle of some stitches and you got carried away and filled it all in. That's the time that I'm most likely to do this. Now, the last method of dealing with a mistake that you discovered in your project might be a little bit hard to swallow. Maybe you don't fix it. There's a long tradition in many cultures of deliberately leaving what would be considered a flaw or a mistake in handcrafted projects. Navajo rug weavers would leave what's called a spirit line to signify the continuation of the craft throughout the generations. Pulkari weavers in Punjab, India will leave changes in color in order to signify the life changes of the wearer. Anishinaabe bead workers would leave a humility bead to signify their own acknowledgement of their imperfection and humility before the Creator. And in 10th century China, in Taoism, introduced the concept of what we now call wabi-sabi, the appreciation of the beauty of imperfection, imperfectly perfect. So maybe you just leave that mistake in there. It might require you to make some changes somewhere down the line, to add a stitch here, add a row there, take a page out of the Marines' book, improvise, adapt, and overcome. When I have test stitchers working on my projects, I often will change the pattern to match what they did rather than demanding that they undo a bunch of stitches if it's not super significant. It doesn't work for all projects, because if it needs to be really symmetrical or if it's going to be a glaring mistake that distorts the project, then yeah, go ahead and fix it. But think about whether anyone else is ever going to be able to tell. Only you know what it was really supposed to be, so as long as the aesthetic still works and as long as the meaning of the project still comes through, maybe it's not a mistake. Maybe it's just an on-the-fly customization that you made accidentally. So those are my best ways of dealing with it when I get an unwanted visit from the frog. If I really need to fix it, I use one of the techniques that I showed you today in order to do so with as little heartbreak as possible. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and if you have a question you'd like me to answer in a future video, leave that in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, I'm Ford, and I'll see you next time.